Let me tell you something before we start. I was going to be a pastor, seminary, the whole thing. Third year, I found Spinoza's banned book in the library. What I read that night, I never went back. And today I'm going to show you exactly what he discovered.
Stop. You have been reading a book built mostly by a man who never met Jesus. I need you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further. Not as a provocation, as a fact. A chronological, documentable, scholarly consensus fact that the institutions responsible for transmitting that book have managed for 2,000 years to keep from sitting at the front of the conversation where it belongs. The religion, you know, its theology, its framework of sin and salvation, its understanding of what happened on the cross and why, was built primarily not from the words of the man it claims to follow, but from the letters of a man who never walked with him, never heard him preach, never sat at a table with him, never asked him a single question. Spinoza was the first modern thinker to trace this with systematic precision. What he found, working through the text with the same methodological discipline he applied to everything else, is that the hidden chronology of the New Testament changes not just how you read the documents. It changes what you understand yourself to be reading when you read them. I want to take you through that chronology. But before I do, I need to tell you about a moment in a seminary room in Norwich that I have not discussed from this chair before, because it is the moment that made everything else in this conversation unavoidable for me. And I think you deserve to understand why this matters personally, not just academically, before I give you the dates. Stop and count. How many books in the New Testament were written by Paul? Take a moment. You know the answer is substantial. But the number, when you sit with it precisely, is more substantial than most people realize. The New Testament contains 27 texts. Paul is credited with 13 of them. Scholars who have spent careers on the question of authorship, applying the same linguistic and stylistic analysis that Spinoza pioneered, have concluded that 7 of those 13 are almost certainly authentic. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. The other 6 are disputed or pseudonymous. But even the undisputed 7 represent, in terms of theological content, the foundation on which the entire structure of Christian doctrine is built. That is not a marginal figure. That is nearly a quarter of the complete New Testament, from one man, who by his own explicit written admission had never met the person the book is about. And here is why that number matters in a way that most introductions to the New Testament never quite explain. When scholars talk about the Pauline corpus, the 7 letters they consider authentically his, they are not talking about personal correspondence. They are talking about systematic theological argument. Romans alone is a document of sustained philosophical and theological reasoning that shaped Luther, Calvin, Augustine, and every major tradition of Western Christianity that came after them. 1 Corinthians contains the earliest creedal formula in the entire Christian tradition. Paul's description of the resurrection appearances, written when living memory of the events was still possible. Galatians, which we will come back to in some detail, contains the most explicit statement of Paul's method that any biblical author ever produced. This is the architecture of Christianity, and it was built by a man whose only qualification was a vision on a road to Damascus. But I am getting ahead of myself. The chronology comes first. The chronology is what Spinoza followed, and it is what I want to follow with you. Now listen carefully, because the date that changes everything is not in the Gospels. It is in a letter, and the letter is the oldest Christian text that exists. 1st Thessalonians. Written approximately 50 years after the Common Era. Scholars place it with reasonable confidence at around 49 or 50 of the Common Era. That is the anchor point. That is the earliest Christian writing in existence, written when the memory of the Nazarene's death was perhaps 17 or 18 years old. Living memory. There were people alive who had been adults when it happened. And what does Paul write about in the oldest Christian text in existence? What does he describe from those 17 years of Christianity? Not the Sermon on the Mount, not the parables, not the Lord's Prayer, not Lazarus or the feeding of the multitudes, or the healing of the blind man at the pool of Siloam. None of it. Paul writes about the second coming, about the resurrection of the dead, about the theological meaning of Jesus' death, about the community's grief for those who had already died before the expected return. He writes as a theologian already working with a complete interpretive framework. He does not write as someone transmitting the teachings of a recently dead teacher. And the date that makes this consequential, the date I want you to hold against that one, is roughly 70 of the Common Era. That is when the first Gospel appears. The Gospel of Mark, widely accepted by New Testament scholars as the earliest of the 4 canonical accounts of Jesus' life. Written approximately 20 years after Paul's first letter. Written approximately 40 years after the death of Jesus. Paul comes first. The Gospels come after. I want to say that plainly one more time because the institutional presentation of the canon, Gospels, then Acts, then letters, trains every reader to experience it the other way around. You read Matthew first. You read Paul later. You feel Paul confirming what Matthew told you. But that is the order of the canon, which was an editorial decision made centuries after these documents were written. It is not the order of history. Let me give you the full sequence. Paul's 7 authenticated letters. 1 Thessalonians, approximately 50 of the Common Era. Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, somewhere between 50 and 57. Philippians and Philemon, slightly uncertain, possibly mid-50s. Paul is almost certainly dead by the mid-60s, executed in Rome during the Neronian persecution. Gospel of Mark, approximately 70 of the Common Era. Gospel of Matthew, approximately 80 to 85. Gospel of Luke, approximately 85 to 90. Gospel of John, approximately 95 to 100. Paul wrote before any gospel existed. Paul's letters were being circulated among Christian communities before anyone had a written account of the life of Jesus. The communities that first read Paul, the communities in Corinth, in Galatia, in Rome, knew Jesus through Paul's interpretation before they knew Jesus through any narrative account of what he had actually said and done. I remember the first time I saw this laid out clearly, not as separate dates scattered through a commentary, but as a visual sequence written in chalk on a blackboard during a textual criticism seminar in Durham in the 1980s. The professor wrote the dates without commentary. He put Paul on the left side of the board. He put the Gospels on the right. He drew a line between them. No one in the room said anything. He turned back to the board and continued the lecture. I wrote the dates in my notebook, and I sat with them in silence for the rest of the session, because I had known abstractly that Paul's letters were early. I had studied their dates. I had taught from them, but I had never seen them arranged against the gospel dates in a single visual comparison, and the effect of seeing them that way was not what I would have expected. It was not an intellectual excitement. It was closer to the feeling of looking at a shelf of books you have owned for years and realizing that someone has replaced them all with different editions while you were away, and the content has subtly changed, and you cannot point to exactly when it happened. By the time I had walked back to my college that evening, the implication had settled completely. Paul arrived first, not as a supplement to Jesus' teaching, not as a confirming echo. First, in the timeline of Christianity as a body of written thought, Paul precedes Jesus. What I'm about to show you next is the kind of thing that gets academic papers quietly set aside rather than rejected outright. Not because it is wrong, because it is right, and it is uncomfortable, and the institutions that manage the received account of Christian origins have consistent and understandable reasons for preferring a different emphasis. There is a sentence in Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, that I had read many times before that Durham seminar. I had taught it. I had quoted it in lectures. I had treated it as a declaration of Paul's authority. And then I read it again after that seminar, and I read it differently. Paul writes, "The gospel I proclaimed is not of human origin. I received it not from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." Spinoza returned to this passage more than once in his analysis of the Pauline corpus, because what Paul is saying in that sentence is not simply a declaration of divine authority. It is an explicit rejection of the chain of testimony that connects doctrine to its source. Paul is saying, I did not ask the disciples what Jesus taught. I did not consult the eyewitnesses. My source is a vision. My authority is not testimonial. It is revelatory. That distinction matters enormously, because it means that when Paul builds his theology, he is not building on reports from people who knew Jesus. He is building on his own interpretive framework, shaped by a vision, filtered through his training as a Pharisee, and organized according to his education in Tarsus, a city with a strong tradition of Stoic and Platonic thought. He is not a reporter, he is a theologian constructing a system, and his own words confirm that this was not accidental. It was, by his explicit account, his method. Now, 3 doctrines that form the core of Christian theology. None of them, in the form Paul presents them, are in the Gospels. I will name all 3. The theology of substitutionary atonement, the idea that Jesus died as a sacrifice to atone for the sins of humanity, that his death was a payment for guilt that humanity could not discharge itself. This is the central mechanism of Christian soteriology. It is Paul's construction. The Synoptic Gospels present the death of Jesus as a tragedy, as a confrontation with human corruption, as the consequence of a political and religious power structure defending itself. They do not present it as a transaction designed to satisfy divine justice. The transactional theology of the cross is Pauline. It is not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke in the form that Paul gave it. Salvation by grace through faith, not by the works of the law. This is the doctrine that drove the Reformation, that Luther found in Romans and Galatians, and that he turned into the defining theological claim of Protestant Christianity. It is Paul's argument, developed across his letters, specifically in polemical response to the Jewish Christianity of Jerusalem that insisted on Torah observance. It is not what Jesus taught. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus says explicitly, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Paul, in his letter to the Romans, argues at length that the law has been superseded. The trajectory Paul traces is a departure from the position the Gospels attribute to Jesus. This is not a minor theological nuance. It is a structural contradiction between the 2 most important figures in the New Testament, and the institutions of Christianity have spent 2,000 years managing the gap rather than acknowledging it. The bodily resurrection as theological cornerstone. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, builds the entire weight of Christian hope on the resurrection of the body. It is his most sustained theological argument. The passage begins with what he presents as a creedal formula, the earliest such formula we have anywhere, and it runs to 58 verses. For Paul, without the resurrection, faith is empty. "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile," he writes. That is Paul's framing. It is the framing that has governed Christian theology ever since, and it draws directly on Paul's encounter on the Damascus Road. A vision, not a physical encounter with the risen Jesus. The Damascus Road. I want to take you there for a moment, because it is the source of everything Paul claims. In 3 separate accounts, Galatians 1, Acts 9, and Acts 22, Paul's tradition describes the event that transformed him from a persecutor of Christians into their most prolific theological advocate. The accounts are not identical. In Acts 9, those with Paul hear the voice but see nothing. In Acts 22, they see the light but do not hear the voice. In Galatians, Paul describes it simply as a revelation of Jesus Christ, with no narrative detail. The event that grounds Paul's entire authority is described 3 times in his own tradition, and the 3 descriptions do not agree on the basic facts of what happened. And here is where something important happens for me personally. Something I spent a considerable time deciding whether to say from this chair, because it touches a place in my own history that I prefer not to disturb lightly. I was preparing a lecture. This was in Norwich in the late 1980s when I was still at the seminary. The topic was apostolic authority, the question of how the early church established and justified the authority of its teachers. I was working at my desk, which faces a window that looks onto a garden that, in the particular late October of that year, had gone thoroughly and unglamorously brown. Every shrub defeated, leaves already down, old papers on the desk, cold tea in a cup I kept meaning to finish. The kind of afternoon that academic preparation always happens in, when the comfortable ordinariness of the surroundings makes the question on the page seem abstract and manageable. I was reading Galatians 1 verse 12. I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. I had read it before, probably 30 times. I had taught it. I had framed it as evidence of Paul's special authority, the divine source of his commission. I read it again, and this time I noticed what was not there. Paul had met James, the brother of Jesus. He says so himself in Galatians chapter 1 verse 19. He spent 15 days in Jerusalem with Peter, and he met James. 15 days in the company of the man who had grown up with Jesus, who had known him from childhood, who could have described his brother's manner of speaking, his habits, his teachings, the things he had said in private, the arguments he found tiresome, the moments he found moving. And Paul explicitly states that his gospel was not received from any man, not from Peter, not from James, not from any of the disciples who had actually been there. He had the source. He declined to use it. I put the page down. I looked at the brown garden. I drank the cold tea without quite noticing I was doing it. I had spent years teaching Paul's statement as a declaration of divine authority, as evidence that God had chosen Paul directly. And it was only sitting there, in the particular exhaustion of that October afternoon, that I recognized what I had been doing. I had been reading the Declaration of Independence as if it were a letter of recommendation. Paul was not saying, "God told me," which confirms what the disciples knew. Paul was saying, "God told me," which supersedes what the disciples knew. The rejection of human testimony was not incidental to his claim. It was the whole point of it. The gap between "I received a vision" and "I was there" is not a spiritual gap. It is an epistemological one. The disciples had testimony. Paul had an experience. And the question of what those two things are worth relative to each other is precisely the question that Paul's claim forces you to ask. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 8, Paul himself provides what might be the most honest sentence he ever wrote. He is listing the people to whom the risen Christ appeared, beginning with Peter and the 12, and ending with himself. And he says, "Last of all he appeared also to me as to one abnormally born." As to one abnormally born. His own words. He is acknowledging in the act of claiming authority that his claim is structurally different from every other claim on the list. The others were there. Paul was, by his own description, an anomaly. I want to return to that conference in the north of England, sometime in the mid-90s. The rooms were never quite warm enough, and the coffee was produced by a machine that operated on principles no one had been able to fully explain. I was standing near that machine, which had defeated the person ahead of me and was now silently defeating me, when a scholar I had read extensively came to stand nearby. He had spent his career on the F.C. Bauer School of New Testament Criticism, the 19th century Tübingen scholars who had identified, more than 150 years before the question became fashionable, exactly the fault line I have been describing to you. He picked up his cup, looked at the machine, said nothing about its apparent malfunction, and said, "The question was never whether Paul was faithful to Jesus. The question is what faithful could even mean for someone who never heard him speak." He paused, not dramatically, the way people pause when they are thinking rather than performing. Spinoza asked that in 1670. We are still not answering it. He walked away with his coffee. I do not know how he got it to work. I stood there with mine, which was still not happening. The F.C. Bar observation matters because it places what I am describing in its proper historical context. This is not a recent discovery. This is not something invented by contemporary skeptics looking to destabilize belief. The analytical tool that reveals the gap between Paul and Jesus was identified by 19th century Protestant scholars working from within a deeply Christian intellectual tradition, using exactly the same documentary methods that Spinoza pioneered in the 17th century. The fact that this analysis exists, that it has existed for over 150 years, and that it has not meaningfully entered the theological literacy of the congregations whose faith is built on Paul's letters, that fact is itself a datum about something, about what institutions decide to pass on and what they decide to manage. Spinoza, applying his methodological principles to the Pauline corpus, reaches a conclusion that I want to be precise about. His argument is not that Paul was dishonest. His argument is that Paul was writing as a theologian legislator, as someone constructing a coherent framework for a new community, drawing on the resources available to him. His vision on the Damascus Road, his background as a Pharisee trained in Jewish law, his education in Tarsus, one of the cosmopolitan cities of the Roman world, with a strong tradition of Stoic and Platonic philosophy. Paul's theological architecture is not primarily a transmission of what Jesus taught. It is a synthesis. The concept of the body resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 has deep parallels in Platonic thought about the immortality of the soul, and in Persian Zoroastrian eschatology about the resurrection of the body at the end of time. Paul may have drawn on these consciously as a sophisticated thinker, integrating ideas from multiple traditions. He may have absorbed them unconsciously through the intellectual atmosphere of Tarsus and Hellenistic Judaism. Either way, the architecture he built is not the same structure that the Gospels report. And then there is the incident at Antioch. Galatians 2 verses 11 through 14, Paul describes a confrontation with Peter, the Apostle Peter, traditionally the first bishop of Rome, the man Jesus called the rock on which he would build the church, a man who had walked with Jesus for 3 years. Paul, who never met Jesus, who bases his entire authority on a vision, describes opposing Peter to his face publicly, because Peter had been eating with Gentile Christians, and then withdrew when representatives of James arrived from Jerusalem. Paul describes this confrontation with a composure that barely conceals the fury underneath. He tells Peter that his behavior is not consistent with the gospel. Think about that for a moment. Not the theology of it, the social reality of it. Paul confronts the man who was there, who heard the teachings directly, who was present at the Transfiguration, at Gethsemane, at the empty tomb. And Paul, who arrived late, who received everything through a vision, who explicitly rejected the testimony of eyewitnesses. Paul tells him he is wrong. That incident reveals something about the internal structure of early Christianity that the institutional presentation consistently smooths over. The early church was not a unified movement that gradually expanded outward. It was a contested space, with multiple competing versions of what Christianity meant, argued over by people who had wildly different levels of proximity to the historical Jesus and wildly different theological frameworks. Paul's version eventually prevailed, not because it was the version closest to the teachings of Jesus, but because it was the version most portable to the Gentile world, most coherent as a theological system, most legible to the Greek-speaking Roman Empire. The question is not whether Paul's version was internally consistent. It was. The question is what it was consistent with. And now I need to show you the thing about the canon that changes the whole frame of this conversation. The thing that Spinoza concluded about the institutional presentation of these documents, and that his contemporaries found sufficiently alarming to ensure the book was published anonymously. The New Testament, as you receive it, presents the Gospels first. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Then Acts. Then the letters of Paul. The arrangement creates a specific interpretive experience. You read the life of Jesus. You understand the teachings of Jesus. And then you read Paul as someone who confirms and expands what you have already learned. Paul appears as commentary. The Gospels appear as primary source. But the chronological reality is the opposite. Paul was primary. The Gospels arrived after Paul. The communities that produced the Gospels were communities already shaped by Pauline theology. The Gospels were not the source from which Paul drew. In several significant respects, they may reflect back the influence of the Pauline interpretive framework. The order of the canon is not chronological, it is theological. It arranges the documents to produce a specific interpretive sequence that supports a specific account of how Christian doctrine developed. Spinoza observed that this arrangement is a decision, institutional, deliberate, and consequential. Whether it was made with the explicit intention of suppressing the chronological truth, or whether it was made for reasons of pastoral coherence, the effect is the same. Every reader who encounters the New Testament in canonical order experiences Paul as a confirming echo rather than as an antecedent voice. What you are following, when you read the New Testament in the order in which it is presented to you, is a curated sequence. And the curation has a direction. I want to close with the one thing that Paul and Jesus clearly shared, because it is the pivot that makes everything else in this conversation worth whatever discomfort it has produced. Love. The command to love the neighbor. Both Jesus and Paul make this central. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, verse 39, Jesus names it as the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. In Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 13, verse 10, he writes, love is the fulfilling of the law. They are, on the surface, saying the same thing. But read them carefully, and the difference is already there. For Jesus, in the synoptic tradition, love of neighbor is an ethical imperative. It is present, immediate, concrete. The Samaritan who stops for the wounded man on the road. The father who runs toward the returning son. The love that acts in the specific encounter with the specific person in front of you. It is love as ethics. For Paul, love is the fulfilling of the law. It is framed in relationship to a theological system. It is love as a principle that resolves a doctrinal problem. The problem of what replaces Torah observance as the governing framework of the community. Love is instrumentalized. It is made to do theological work. This is not a small distinction. It is the distinction between a teacher of ethics and a builder of theology. Both are valuable. They are not the same thing, and yet the tradition for 2,000 years has presented them as the same thing. Paul confirming Jesus. Letters following Gospels. The interpreter appearing after the teacher. When the reality is that the interpreter came first, that the communities who would eventually write the Gospels had already been reading Paul for 20 years before anyone committed the life of Jesus to a written narrative. That the theological framework through which the Gospels were written was, in no small part, a framework Paul had already constructed. Spinoza's question, the one he formulated, working through these documents in the 17th century, and the one that has never been answered from any pulpit in any church I have ever entered, is this. When you sit in a pew and you receive the teaching, when you are formed by the documents that constitute Christianity, are you following the ethical vision of Jesus? Or are you following the theological system of Paul? I am not asking you to choose between them. I am not suggesting that Paul's theology is without value, or that the communities it built are without worth. I am asking you to know which one you are receiving, and from whom. Because Spinoza's point is that the gap between following Jesus and following Paul is not a private spiritual question. It is a public historical one. It is answerable with documents. It is answerable with dates. The dates are these. Paul, 50 to 57 of the Common Era. Mark, 70. Matthew and Luke, 80 to 90. John, 95 to 100. In that sequence, the teacher arrives after the interpreter. The life follows the letters. The story of what Jesus said comes after the theological system built from the claim that Jesus was seen. No church has arranged its reading of the New Testament in that order. No church has asked from a pulpit on a Sunday morning whether the congregation understands that the theological framework they inhabit was constructed before the narrative tradition that claims to describe its founder. The question is not designed to destroy what you believe. It is designed to locate you accurately within what you are reading. That distinction, in my experience, is worth every difficulty it costs. Take care of yourselves.
These videos take months of research. Most people who watch aren't subscribed. If this meant something to you, help me keep going. One click. That's all I'm asking.